So in developing professionally teachers, it's done by an enhancing of continuing professional development through the facilitating of the development of learnacy and through the development of noticing skills. That's where the focus of this mentoring program comes from. Okay, so that's the first thing, kind of trying to unpack professional development. The next is this idea that the program wants to kind of enhance research-informed practice. And I think this relates to many conversations that may be going on that I'm hearing and I'm seeing in the literature around the role of theory within EAP, what perhaps Cowley and Haselden and Monbeck call the theory issue in EAP. So what I have on this slide is some of the debates going on in the literature around theory in EAP. So some of it seems to be fairly existential. So what is EAP and what is our legitimacy? Other discussions around course design. But I think perhaps most of the discussion is around how theory and practice, a perceived gap there is, and how theory can be employed more and come out more into practice. And again, from Fitzpatrick et al., one of the conclusions was, and they say, the need for colleagues not only to keep abreast of current research within the field, part of professional development that we talked about, but also the need to know how these ideas can be applied in practice. I've got issues with the word applied, but I'll get back to that in a minute. But just to say that there is a debate going on with theory and how can we use it more and how can it come out more in practice, I would argue. So I think this mentoring program goes some way to addressing that. As if to give a little bit sort of more context or further evidence to the discussions going on. It wasn't long ago when I was sort of directed to a blog called Theory into Practice by Susie Cowley Haselden. I'm just going to try and move this so I can see the slide. Okay, and part of that blog, there was a kind of rationale for why she set this up, and I've got it there on the slide, and she says, one reason I wanted to start the Theory into Practice was a frustration I had within my field, EAP, born of attitudes of reticence at best and disdain at worst. I'm going to move it again, towards theory within our practice. So again, more evidence to suggest that theory and practice is talked about, and we're not really sure how to kind of square that. Is there a gap? Is there not a gap? What we're going to do? Okay. All right, so I'm going to address right at the outset what I think is wrong with observations as development in a kind of simplistic way, but I'll come back to this later once I've talked a little bit about the theoretical underpinnings, and hopefully I'll put a bit more kind of meat on the bone, if you like. I think the first issue with observations, I'm talking about a sort of formal observation, you know, where an experienced other goes and sits in the class, watches somebody teach, and then does some sort of feedback at the end. Okay. Firstly, I think there are issues with who notices and what is noticed. If any effective mentoring program is trying to develop noticing skills in a teacher or a mentee, then the fact that an observer is noticing is not really helpful. You need to be developing the ability of a teacher to notice things, not telling a teacher what you have noticed. So there are learnacy development issues there. I often think that observations really say more about the observer than they do about the teacher or what has been seen in a class. So I think there are issues with who notices. I think there are also issues with who interprets. Often it is the observer who will make interpretations of the situations that they have observed. And I think, again, there are problems with learnacy development here, because I would argue that you need the teacher or the mentee to think of possible interpretations to what they have noticed. And it's through these interpretations, and I'll talk about this a bit more, where you can sort of introduce theory, really. So, and it's important that theory is related to a teacher's own experience and what they value noticing. So I think that's an issue. I think there are issues with who is drawing conclusions and judgments and where they come from. So often in a formal observations, conclusions and judgments come from the observer. And if we've said that part of professional development is the ability to make your own conclusions and judgments, it seems sort of ludicrous that you're not, enabling teachers to make their own conclusions and judgments. Okay. At worst, it can just sort of destroy a relationship, right? If you don't agree with the conclusions and the judgments, or you see it as an attack. And then finally, there's a reporting issue. So I think any mentoring program is confidential, should be confidential, and doesn't get reported anywhere, whereas formal observations are often written down and sent to people. They may or may not look at it, but there is a sense in which it's not confidential. So I think any sort of mentoring program needs to be confidential. And I think this kind of traditional common mentoring practice of observation plus feedback has been dubbed by Maldoror and Hobson as judge mentoring. And this kind of judgmental mentoring, they argue, is detrimental to any sort of meaningful development. So that's my first stab at why observations are not good, but I'll come back and add a bit more to that later. So as a result of that, Hobson came up with a kind of rules of mentoring, which he calls on-side mentoring. And I think this program tries to employ those as well. So I'll go through these briefly. One, that it should be offline. And what they mean by that is separated from line management and non-hierarchical. Easier said than done. One, that it should be non-judgmental and non-evaluative, that it supports mentees' psychosocial needs, it's individualized, tailored to specific and changing needs of the mentee, and developmental. I mean, here Hobson is kind of introduced a break between individualized and developmental. I mean, I could argue that it's sort of the same thing, but anyway. So developmental in terms of Hobson's account is that it's growth orientated, and it's also empowering. So those are the rules for any program of mentoring, and we've tried to employ those as well. So if mentoring is not telling or giving advice, then what are we doing in this program? Well, I think some of what this mentoring program does, there are different roles within it. Some of it does include telling. So the first 4 roles on the slide there, the model role, acculturator, support, and sponsor, I'm not going to talk about. Although important, I don't think they're that controversial, and some of it is telling. So the second role, for example, providing information on how, when to carry out school requirements. I mean, you just tell somebody, right? But really what I'm thinking about in terms of mentoring is that final educator role, because any kind of what they call mentorial, so a sort of two-way conversation, is going to be concerned with that educator role more often than not, okay? So the educator role involves guiding discussions through what they call systematic informed reflective practice, or SIRP, about a lesson that a mentee has taught, but you do that post-lesson and the mentor doesn't go and have a look at it. Why? Because you're trying to develop the noticing skills of the mentee to enable them to take account of pupil feedback so that the mentee is able to make their own judgments and decisions. So most of what goes on in a mentor relationship will involve that kind of systematic informed reflective practice post-lesson. I mean, ideally. In doing that, so in doing that educator role, in doing that SIRP, I'm taking this from Maldoror 2024. There is a 5-step process. I'll briefly discuss what we do and why, and come back to this after I've talked a little bit about the theory. So the first thing you would do is you would ask a mentee to describe what happened within their lesson, to try and establish a focus for the rest of the discussion. So here we're asking a mentee to pick something that they feel from their own experience is worth talking about. It could be negative, it could be positive, whatever it might be. So for example, a mentee might say something like, oh, I don't know, 3 students were at the back of the class with their head in their hands, right? They were obviously bored or whatever. Step 2, we ask the mentee to try and list every possible reason to explain whatever it is that they've noticed. So if it is students with their heads in their hands at the back of the class, it could be, well, they were bored of the lesson. It could be, I don't know, there was a football match on late last night. They've obviously gone out and they're knackered, whatever it might be, right? So lots and lots of possible reasons for whatever it is that you've noticed. Step 3 is, what else do you know? And it's at this point where public theories comes into the discussion. So what do you know about a type of learner, a type of situation, whatever it might be? Now, you might draw upon theories that you know about, or at this point, you might not know. So then you can ask the mentor to some advice. What theories do you know? What do you know that could help to understand this? Okay. Step 4, the most likely explanation, based on the interpretations, based on theories that you may or may not know. What do you think is the reason why, or the most likely explanation for what you talked about in step 1? And then step 5, so what? What is the outcome of all of this discussion? Now, it could be that, your practice, or you're going to make a conscious effort to change your practice or change how you view your practice in the future. It could be that you didn't know anything in step 3 and you want to go and find out more to help to explain what happened in step 1. Okay, so very briefly, that's how a mentorial kind of looks and works out. But you're trying to allow the mentee to reflect or to notice and to draw on their own experience and what they find useful, and then to weave in theories related to their own experience, and it has to be something that they find valuable. Okay, so here I'm going to sort of try and employ a little bit of theory and then go back to those 5 steps again. There are many theoretical underpinnings to the approach. Here are some of them. I'm not going to talk about the last 2, primarily because I can't pronounce the authors' names, but also because I think you I'm going to assume you have some understanding around sort of ideas of flow and the importance of meeting appropriate challenges, and around the importance of meeting basic psychological needs, which are important, but I think you probably already have some understanding of that. But I do want to talk briefly about Claxton and his modes of mind and how that relates to where experience is processed and how you can transfer that into practice or action, if you like. So Claxton talks about different modes of mind, so conscious and unconscious thinking, and his notion was that we really need to use all 3 of these modes of minds as professional. The first mode of mind he talks about is what he calls D-mode thinking, which stands for deliberate or default mode of mind thinking. And this is the kind of thinking which uses logic and reason mediated through language, really. It's the mode of mind that you're probably using now to listen to me. It's the mode of mind that we use when we're, for example, studying or when we are thinking about something. The second conscious mode of mind Claxton talks about is what he calls the fast mind. And this is where we don't have time to think, in inverted commas, we just have to act based on intuition or gut feeling. It's the mode of mind that we use, for example, when we're crossing the road. It's the mode of mind that we often use when we're teaching, when we don't have the time to kind of go through a thinking process, but we are acting because we know that something might work. We are looking at what's going on and we're just making a decision. So that's called fast mind, 2 conscious modes of mind. And then there's a third mode of mind, which he dubs the undermind. And this is where experiential knowing takes place. This is the mode of mind which, because it uses experience, not ideas mediated through language, that is often really difficult to articulate. It takes time, this mode of mind, to work, if you like. But there are occasions when undermined unconscious thinking, experiential learning, can surface into consciousness, but the conditions have to be correct. So if there are conditions of leisure, fun, fantasy, metaphor, this can allow that undermined to sort of surface consciously. So if you think about if you're in the shower and there's been a problem, or you're going for a walk and there's been a problem you've been mulling over for ages and you're not sure of the solution, and suddenly the idea just comes to you immediately. That's the reason why, because you're in that kind of relaxed state that allows it to become conscious. The link to the undermind and fast mind is interesting, according to Claxton. So the products of the fast mind, which are gut feeling and intuition, are a result of experiential learning from the undermind. In other words, your intuition and gut feeling, or action, practice, if you like, are a result of experiential knowing that has come as a product of your undermind working. Now, this is interesting for like broader understandings of how you might set up curriculums or courses, and are you allowing for all these modes of minds to work? But I think for the purposes of this, I think it's interesting to understand how one might enable research-informed practice. I'll come back to this in a second. So one of the reasons, therefore, for step 2 in the mentoring kind of 5-step process, to think of as many crazy, fanciful interpretations of whatever you've noticed, is to allow that undermind to work later on. Just give as many interpretations for what you think is going on as possible, and make them silly, make them fun. As Maldoror says, fun is a really serious business, right?